pleasure.
Oh, okay. So, do we want to start now? Okay. Today, the Information Organization Research Group invited a speaker, and I'm glad that the turnout is pretty good. I guess it's not just the class itself, right? And our speaker today is Tom Dosha. He is a doctoral student at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and his research interest is in the history and theory of knowledge organization. And I've heard him talking at the conference, and I think Richard heard him at the past Eastbook in Rome. We were all very impressed by his work, so we invited him to give us a talk today. So I'll give the floor to Tom.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your kind introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank the SOIs for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I am happy to present some of the first fruits of research that this will be eventually incorporated into my dissertation. So today I will be speaking on Paul Otlet, the UDC, and the origins of the concept of a documentary language, looking at how certain linguistic thought has influenced the conceptualization of knowledge organization systems. Within the field of knowledge organization, a central concern, of course, is with the different systems by which we characterize documentary units. And over the last 10 to 15 years, a general umbrella term has come into existence and started to be used more and more within knowledge organization systems. This term is applied inter alia to classifications, to thesauri, subject heading systems, ontologies, and many, many other similar types of systems. One could easily include coordinate indexing languages, folksonomies, etc. Now there are certain every term, one might say, carries with it a certain conceptual overlay or connotation, and it is important to recognize those. In my reading, some of the underlying premises of knowledge organization systems is that the primary building. Some of the premises are that the primary building block of knowledge is the concept, and that knowledge organization systems seek to organize concepts. The goal of KOS then is to identify concepts and to assign names to them, to identify the relationships between the concepts and to identify names to those relationships, and to provide a conceptual map of a given universe of knowledge by structuring those concepts in terms of the relationships that obtain between them, or that are created. Now, there are two dimensions, of course, to this conceptualization. On the one hand, there is the concept, which some people take to be a mental notion, other people as more of an intersubjective notion. But there is also a linguistic moment, because we not only have to identify concepts as such, but we also have to name them to represent them in language. And it is this linguistic moment that has been acknowledged actually in other traditions and other ways of naming some of these same systems. An alternate designation for many of the traditional types of knowledge organization systems, such as classification, thesauri, and indexing schemes, is documentary languages. And there are actually a host of synonymous terms that have developed over the last 30 or 40 years. People have called them information languages, information retrieval languages, index languages, subject languages, and if you read Smenonius, she will give you about 10 or 11 different types of languages. But I will call them by the name that appears to have been most thoroughly embedded in the literature, and that is also most generalizable, and that is documentary languages. Now, what are the underlying premises of a documentary language? Although the literature on documentary languages has been written from a variety of different linguistic perspectives, there are a few common denominators that I would identify. First and foremost, the concept of documentary languages holds that classifications and the indexing systems can be viewed as a particular type of artificial language. And this artificial language consists of a lexicon, or a vocabulary of terms representing the concepts, and a syntax for combining them. In the literature, you will often find the statement that actually the minimal requirement for a documentary language is the vocabulary, which may or may not be structured, but that many systems will also include some sort of system for combining them. Those of you who have come across the term syntagmatic in your work will recognize that as forming part of the syntax. And finally, the goal of a documentary language is to facilitate what has been called by the wonderful term of documentary communication within the framework of a documentary retrieval system. And what that basically means is that in any information retrieval or documentary retrieval system, there are different vocabularies at play. On the one hand, one has an author who will write a work in his or her own idiolect, his or her own variant of the natural language in which he or she naturally communicates. And that, of course, then has to be, and that is at one pole. At the other pole, of course, you have the person who is using a documentary system and who wants documents or information resources on a particular topic. And of course, that person has his or her own idiolect, which will be conditioned by education, by the type of domain within which he or she is working, and so on. And the documentary language then serves as sort of a norming medium and a mediating language between them. Because on the one hand, the indexer must take documents that have been redacted in the idiolect of the authors and provide linguistic representations for them in the form of classification names or in the form of subject headings. And on the other hand, then the user has to be guided as to which types of names are most likely to lead to a fruitful search. And so the documentary language then has often been conceptualized as a form of switching language, where if one can provide lead-in terms from the type of language that the user is most likely to use, and have those lead-in terms and translate those lead-in terms into the documentary language, that then the documentary language can serve as a device for directing the user to collocated sets of documents dealing with the topic that he or she is after. So that, in a nutshell, is the theory of the documentary language. Now, KOSs has come into vogue as an analytical category within the last 10 to 15 years. Now, the conceptualization of KOSs as types of artificial languages is considerably older, and it enjoyed a special currency in LIS during the 1960s and the 1970s. Since then, the concept of the documentary language has continued to figure prominently in European, particularly in Francophone LIS. That has not been the case within, however, the Anglophone world, where, again, the term KOS and the analytic category KOS has come to supplant, to a certain degree, the notion of a documentary language. Within Anglophone LIS, perhaps the most prominent advocates in recent years have, of course, been Svenonius, who I mentioned earlier, and Michael Buckland, who has written a couple of general articles on the importance of vocabulary and also on the idea of naming within the perspective of an information retrieval system. But nevertheless, the idea of documentary language has been historically important. And thus it is appropriate to inquire about its origins. Where did the term come from and how was it originally formulated? These are not idle questions because original formulations often condition how a given concept then develops. They set, shall we say, certain constraints and traditions into play that then influence the ulterior development of that concept. And so it is, I think, worthwhile to ask, given that the tradition of that idea of documentary languages has been prominent, what was its origin point and how was it formulated? Now there hasn't been any synthetic treatment of the history of the idea of documentary languages in the literature. However, proponents of the idea have offered their own suggestions about the origins of the idea. A couple of French scholars, Jacques Chaumier and Jacques Manier, have claimed in various introductory writings on documentary languages that the concept of a documentary language first emerged in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Now, this seems like a very plausible suggestion, because it was in the 1950s and the 1960s that information retrieval began developing as a field, and linguistic analysis was considered was an important part of information retrieval, in large part because many of the early projects in information retrieval, such as the semantic code at Case Western University, were developed in conjunction with programs for machine translation between different natural languages. And as a result, linguistic analysis really came to the fore theoretically. So that seems like a plausible idea, but there is a hitch, and that is that Shyali Ramamrita Ranganathan, the famous classificationist, was already describing his koan classification as a classificatory language in 1944, well before the IR movement was underway. Now, Ranganathan, of course, is a seminal figure within the history of KO, and one might think that this might be another Ranganathian contribution to the discourse of the field and an innovation. But actually, one can go back yet further. Elaine Svenonius has suggested that a much earlier candidate, Julius Otto Kaiser, the developer of a proto-faceted indexing scheme called systematic indexing, and she has claimed that he was the first to recognize indexing language qua a language with grammatical categories and the rules of syntax. Now, prima facie, this also seems very, very plausible, because if one reads Kaiser's systematic indexing, one sees that he takes a very rigorous approach to the development of an indexing system. He was the first. He claimed that all indexing terms could be divided into two categories: concretes or processes, that one can file by concretes, and proposed what can be recognized as syntactic rules for filing. So that he claimed that in creating an alphabetical index file, one would always have the main term be a concrete that would be subdivided by a process. That is a syntactic rule, and thus one might want to follow Svenonius in this. The fly in the ointment is that while it is true that in practice Kaiser devised a detailed set of rules for the categorization and combination of index terms, he never spoke of his method as constituting a language as such, and does not seem to have conceptualized it as such. He viewed it as an analysis of information based on knowledge rather than on language. So that one might say that he developed an informal notion of linguistic analysis, but he did not conceptualize indexing as a type of artificial language. I should like to propose that a better candidate for the title of originator of the concept of documentary languages is Kaiser's contemporary Paul Otlet, so much an innovator in so many things within our field. Today, Otlet is best known as being the leading force behind the origin of the documentation movement in Europe. And anybody who has read Boyd Rayward's luminous studies on Otlet will also recognize him as somebody who really envisioned a global notion of information channeled through a network of documentary sources that is very, very reminiscent of the hypertextual systems that we all know and love today. He is also known for co-founding and organizing a number of institutions devoted to universal bibliographic projects and documentation. The most famous and long-lasting of these was the International Institute of Bibliography, which he co-founded in 1895, which eventually became the International Institute for Documentation, and finally the Fédération Internationale de Documentation, which is a longer English name that I don't remember, that served as a primary catalyst in certain forms of bibliographic control and in international classification throughout much of the 20th century. Now, the IIB was articulated around a grand project that Otlet had in mind, which was called the Universal Bibliographic Repertory, or the RBU, which was going to be, so to speak, a master catalog of all the documentary production in the world. And to support that, he co-created the Universal SML Classification, which was a classification of encyclopedic ambitions, and that was going to serve as the organizing mechanism for this massive repertory, which would be housed in Brussels, and that would serve as a sort of master repertory from which libraries the world over could draw in developing their own local systems. So Otlet, I will be claiming today, conceptualized the UDC not only as a classification, which you have come across probably in your readings, but also as a documentary language. And so my aim will be twofold. First, to examine closely and critically Otlet's characterization of the UDC as a language, primarily for bibliographic, but if time allows, for some fun extra-bibliographic uses that he proposed for it. And second, to discuss the legacy of Otlet's vision of the UDC as a universal artificial language for LIS. In looking at Otlet's characterization, I shall be drawing upon three primary sources, three articles that he wrote, two in 1895, 1896, when he was getting the UDC off the ground, proposing it as an international standard, and then one from 1906, when he was trying to develop the notion a bit further than he had a decade previously. So we'll begin by looking at an initial, what we initially tried to do, which would be to reconceptualize the decimal classification, by which we mean the Dewey decimal classification, which he took over, as a language. So when Otlet and his collaborator, Henri Lafontaine, chose Melville Dewey's decimal classification as the basis for their own, they were especially impressed with the expressiveness of its notation. And so here is again a very simple example, just to refresh our memory. Suppose you have the class number electricity 537. 5, of course, will then give us the general disciplinary framework that of the sciences. The second division of the hierarchy will be physics, physics being a type of science. Then 537 will use electricity as a subdivision of physics, that is a subject area within the discipline of science, within the more general transdisciplinary notion of the sciences. This notation was supposed to render transparent the place of each class within the hierarchy, thus revealing, in Otlet's words, the filiation, the very genealogy of ideas and objects, their relationship of dependence and subordination, that which they have in common and that in which they differ. Now, in Otlet's view, the underlying classificatory structure that was expressed in such a notation assured that not only does each digit express in its fashion an essential idea, but the combination of digits, i.e. their rank in the series and their place in the number, is realized according to the very laws of scientific thought. Now in this, he was playing a bit fast and loose with the idea, because it was not each digit, but actually only each digit in a particular place that actually carried then semantic significance. And so on the semantic side, what does he mean by according to the very laws of scientific logic? Because if one looks at the UDC, one notices, one of the first things that one notices is that it doesn't follow the classificatory order of genus, species very well at all. The inclusion relation is not very rigorously maintained. I think that what he meant by that is simply that a DC number like 537 represents the 7th subdivision of the 3rd subclass of the 5th main class of the classification. So from the perspective of the notation, then, every digit has its rationale. And that, I suspect, is what he meant by the very laws of scientific logic, rather than by sort of the semantic side, which was a good deal more dodgy. Now, as a consequence of the regimentation of the use of digits within the notation to indicate place within a hierarchy, he made what I take to be his central claim, which is that the class numbers of the decimal classification constitute a veritably new language, the phrases of which, here the class numbers, are formed according to constant syntactic rules by means of words, here the digits. It is a sort of agglutinative language. The digits are its roots, predicative and attributive roots, purely verbal roots in the sense that they are neither nouns nor adjectives nor verbs. I see that I've put in the French pronunciation. I mean the orthography. They are placed above and beyond every grammatical category that they express abstractions, pure scientific categories. This is a grandiloquent statement in a classic Otlet style, and so I think that so that my first task will be to unpack this and to explain some of the terminology that Otlet was using. First thing to note is that for him, the class number in the classification is serving as a phrase. Now that he uses the French word phrase, which can mean either phrase or sentence, and it is not entirely clear which. I will be using phrase here out of the perhaps clunky Anglophone speaker sense that we are dealing with noun phrases rather than with sentences. But I should make clear that for Otlet, he was not necessarily thinking in terms of the noun phrase as such. And second, he equates digits, individual digits, with words. I bring this up simply because later on we shall see there are certain inconsistencies in his representation of this. But, so that what we must think of is that in a phrase such as 537 is a phrase, the 5, the 3, and the 7, at least at the outset, he's claiming are words. So with that preamble in mind, let's take a closer look at what he has to say. So Otlet claimed that the UDC is a form of agglutinating language. How many of you have heard that term? So here then is an explanation. An agglutinating language, according to linguists, are languages in which words are formed by the addition of prefixes, infixes, and suffixes to a word root, with each of these fixes representing one and only one piece of semantic or grammatical information about the meaning of the word. Now, agglutinating languages, of which, say, Hungarian and Turkish are often given as prime examples, differ from inflecting languages that some of you will know and love, like Latin, French, Russian, etc., in that the suffix ending of inflected languages can represent 2 or more pieces of semantic or grammatical information about the meaning of a word, while the agglutinative language has a one-to-one correspondence between the suffix and an idea. Let's concretize this with an example. Suppose we have the sentence, librarians love books, which I take to be, if we look in Hungarian, that would translate into könyvtárosok könyveket szeretnek. Librarians books love. Let's take a look at könyveket. There you have a word root, könyv, which means book, and a noun, plus the suffix ek, which indicates that it's a plural, plus an additional suffix et that indicates that it's an accusative or direct object form. So that what you have is essentially is a formation where you have noun plus plural form plus accusative form. Compare that to an inflected language like Latin, where you have librari amant libros, librarians love books. If we look at the correlate to könyveket, that would be libros, where you have liber book, which is noun, plus the ending os, which communicates that it's both accusative and that it's a plural. Those two grammatical aspects of the word have been smushed together into a single suffix, and you cannot analyze the suffix out, that one element would indicate plurality and the other accusativity. So that, what does this mean in grammatical terms? First, it means that word forms in agglutinative languages reflect the individual semantic or grammatical components of a word in a very transparent, analytical way. It also means that often enough agglutinative language just will tend to have more endings, because you have to have an ending for each individual grammatical idea that's being communicated by the word. So that for Otlet, to assert that the decimal classification was a sort of agglutinative language was to claim that its class numbers were built up by adding individual digits to the end of the number, each digit providing an additional semantic element to the meaning of the class number. Now, to be told, truth be told, here again, I think that Otlet was taking some license with the notion of agglutination, because UDC numbers tend to be hierarchical, so that you don't have individual sort of neat semantic components that are being added additively to the word root like you do in a truly agglutinative word or an agglutinative system. But rather what you have is, again, sort of a narrowing of intention each time you go a layer down further into the hierarchy. So I think the comparison here is not at all precise in a linguistic sense, but it got across, he was trying to get across the idea that you could keep on ending numbers to the end of a class number, and that would produce that each of those numbers would then indicate a different class in the hierarchy, and you could decompose them. So that if you have 537, you can think sciences, physics, electricity, each of which is a separate unit, even though with 537 you end up with electricity as what you're actually expressing. Note, by the way, that Ranganathan would also claim that classificatory language constitutes what he called a pure agglutinative language. The difference being that he was also dealing with phase relationships where you have a truer possibility for agglutination, and that you have more of an additive relationship between the analytic units that are being placed together. So there we have at least the notion of agglutination. You'll remember that Otlet goes on to claim that the digits are its roots. And just to refresh our grammatical memory, a root in traditional grammatical parlance refers to the morphologically most primitive core of a word. So say you have the words predicate and the malediction. It's the dic in each, the DIC, that constitutes the root. In formation and formalistic, it's form, doc in documentation, and indoctrinate. That forms the semantic core of the word around which then different suffixes, prefixes, etc. are built. He goes on to, so having established that these are supposed to be roots, he goes on to say, they are predicative and attributive roots. Roots purely verbal in the sense that they are neither noun, adjective, or verb. Let's begin with predicative and attributive roots. This is a term that one doesn't find much among linguists nowadays anymore either, because this is a term of traditional linguistic terminology from the 19th century. According to which predicative and attributive roots are those which mark an action or a manner of being in the most indeterminate fashion, that is, apart from all indication of time, place, person, or number. So let's go back to the example of dic, or DIC, in predicate, malediction, dictation, and dictaphone, to take 4 words. In each of those words, DIC indicates that the basic notion is to speak, or that the word has something to do with speech, but it only indicates that in an indeterminate, in a generally grammatically indeterminate way. You then need the further prefixes and suffixes to specify precisely how the notion of speech is being used. So for Otlet, he is making a similar claim that each number or root is not being tied in to a specific, it's not being grammatically determined in any way, but it's functioning in a sense beyond the specifying grammatic, it is being placed beyond every grammatical category. From this, he drew the conclusion that the digits in class numbers express ideas, that is to say, abstractions and pure scientific categories. In this way, they transcend any linguistic particularity. Thus, if you have the number 537, you can index it to, on the one hand, to words such as electricity, or if one wanted to really search long and hard for a synonym for electricity, one might come up with something like electric potency. However, what 537 really indicates is the notion of electricity apart from any grammatical determination. Here, electricity is a noun. Here, electric is an adjective. Electricity, however, is beyond, shall we say, substantivity or beyond adjectives in this view. Electricity is simply grammatically indeterminate but semantically meaningful concept. Hence, you can end up with the schema that 537 indicates the idea of electricity tout court. As we shall see, this would be developed later on by Otlet. Interesting. So, Otlet assumed that the decimal classification's class numbers were correlated with ideas absolutely common to the entire scientific world. Now, this is a postulate of conceptual universalism that most of us, of course, will understand as problematic today, because not all people, when they are speaking of a concept, are necessarily going to be thinking of the concept in quite the same way or from the same frame. But in any case, this is, in a sense, a concept that was not only common in the late 19th century, but it actually has very deep roots in Western culture as a whole. Professor Olson here has written about the Aristotelian legacy of classification. Here we have a very, very long distance echo. The notion that different words can be correlated with a single concept that will be the same for all people everywhere. The second assumption was that the Arabic numerals used to form the decimal classification's class numbers were universally known. That is a postulate of notational universalism. You put those together, and then you get to Otlet's conclusion that the decimal classification constitutes a veritable international scientific language, a complete symbol system of science capable, perhaps, of one day bringing to intellectual workers an aid analogous to that which they received from Latin in the Middle Ages and during the modern period. Note here that Otlet is emphasizing the internationality of the decimal classification, something that he can do because of his postulates of conceptual universality and notational universality. Its role as an aid to scientific research. He was thinking very much of the idea of how to make a scientific communication easy bibliographic communication, documentary communication, if you will, easier across international and linguistic boundaries. And this was an idea that was very current in the 1890s and the first decades of the 1900s. The notion that despite the growing nationalism within Europe, that science is a purely international endeavor, and that one should, and if science, of course, is a cumulative endeavor, that one should seek to make communication as seamless between the different linguistic and national communities as possible. And finally, it's assimilation to a language used for special scholastic purposes. He's comparing it to Latin, which is a pretty major claim. At the same an analogy that would have that in a sense made sense, because in the Middle Ages, Latin, of course, was used primarily outside of the church in university settings, which would differ. And universities were, of course, scattered throughout Europe, where there were different vernaculars being spoken. So Latin, again, was a language that helped to unify European culture in the Middle Ages. Otlet was claiming that at least on the bibliographic level, the decimal classification could perform a similar function in the 20th century. Thus, that in any case was Otlet's first take as to what the Dewey's decimal classification could do for science. However, he went on then to note some limitations and to try to extend the syntactic possibilities of the decimal classification language. Although deeply appreciative of the expressive possibilities, he and his collaborators recognized that theoretically complex subjects could be decomposed into a number of different points of view. Say you have marriage law in England. That can be classed in the decimal classification as private law, marriage in England, which equals this number. However, why couldn't you do it with England as the main term or the main head, and then drill down to marriage? That's a flexibility that you do not have in Dewey, and that Otlet wanted to take. The reason why you can't do it in Dewey is that it's because of the predominantly hierarchical nature of the classification's notation. As Otlet put it, the classificatory numbers are formed by a sort of derivation in specifying, by means of simple juxtaposed numbers, a more general idea in a more particular idea. So again, if you have 537 electricity, this can tell you that the structure of the number can tell you that this belongs to physics and this belongs to science, but it doesn't allow you any collateral motion between different classes in the universe of knowledge. In Otlet's view, a formation of numbers by hierarchical derivation alone led to unnecessarily long hierarchical chains that would make them difficult to read. Because if you're going to specify further, you cannot go laterally. You can only agglutinate by adding numbers to the end of each class number. You end up with very large numbers, some of them not always structurally sound from the conceptual point of view. Well, many of you will have heard about decimal Procrusteanism. That was a typical charge levied against the Dewey version of the system. So Otlet wanted to find a way to escape that. Now, Otlet's solution was to identify types of ideas that regularly subdivide, or in his parlance, determine the more general ideas in each subject area of the classification, such as times and places in history, geography, etc., languages and philology and literature, etc. This is basically an early statement of facet analysis, where you can take different ideas that can be tied, that can be analyzed out from a more general statements of what a subject is, and to develop separate schedules for it. Further, he wanted to develop a structure of class numbers such that to each category of determinative ideas, that is the facet, whose return is regular, that is regularly occurring classes of subdivisions or facets, there corresponds a mode of notation with a distinct physiognomy or appearance and permanent signification. So not only did he seek to conceptually identify what we would call facets, but he wanted to find a way to express that within the notation of his system. Hence the introduction of notation to introduce some of these special kinds of subdivision. For example, the famous colon, which indicates the relationship between two otherwise autonomous class numbers in which one subdivides the other. The form of presentation, which is basically bibliographic form, both here and outer. Place, time, language, point of view, etc. And for a number of these, he also developed separate facet lists that then would identify some of these recurrent ideas in a more compendious fashion. And here, then, of course, there are a few examples simply to illustrate how the system works. Say that you have the class number 6 related to mining, and you can add a form characterization to make it into periodicals in mining. If you can add a language facet to make it periodicals on mining in English, or mining in the United States, mining in the United States in the 20th century, or mining from the economic point of view. In each case, what you have is an analytically separate notion, your periodical, US 20th century economic point of view that could be, so to speak, agglutinated structure, non-hierarchically to the base class number to create more complex and, dare I say, syntagmatic sort of expressions. Note especially the use of the general relationship sign, which was used to combine two class numbers in the UDC into a composite class number. Suppose you have mining and mathematics. You can create mathematics in relation to mining, or mining in relation to mathematics. Now, Otlet viewed these as, in essence, synonyms, but with different sort of pragmatic functions. If you were classified for a library that's interested primarily in foregrounding the idea of mining, then you could choose mining as the chief verbal root, and then mathematics as the determining subject, or vice versa. If you were cataloging or classifying for a mathematics library, where it might be, you might do some other. So that, according to Otlet, the addition of the new subdivision and relationship signs enabled class numbers to be formed in two different ways rather than one, by derivation and by combination. Now, derivation is the traditional hierarchical specification of a more general idea by means of adding a new digit to a class number encoded in classification tables. So again, that's where you derive a 537 from 53. Combination, on the other hand, is the qualification of a more general idea by combining facet-like structures leading to a composite class number standing outside of the hierarchy that is laid out in the tables of the classification. For example, you combine 622 with 0, 5 in parentheses and equal sign 2 to get, or 622:51 to get a number that is anchored in the hierarchy, but that stands outside of the inclusion relationships that are codified in the hierarchy, however imperfectly. Now, as you might have guessed, Otlet's conceptions of derivation and combination ultimately derived from traditional grammatical categories pertaining to word formation. Derivation in classical grammar refers to the formation of words by the addition of suffixes to a root. So say in blindness, blindly, we say that these are words that are derived from blind by the addition of the suffixes, or dogmatic being derived from dogma. For Otlet, derivation is basically equivalent to what he earlier called agglutination. Combination, on the other hand, is equivalent to the grammatical process of creating compound words from different word roots. So mailman is composed from mail plus man, pigpen from pig plus pen, which converts so that for Otlet, and Otlet explicitly compared the numbers formed by combination with compound words. He writes, the class numbers will be complex numerical expressions, composed from different factors whose respective notions, being juxtaposed, will express a simple complex notion just like compound words in spoken languages. Note also here that he is shifting his conception of the class number slightly, moving from a phrase composed of words or digits to the class number as a word, so to speak, in its own right, that is being composed of different word units put together. So in Otlet's view, the UDC's capacity to generate class numbers by both derivation and combination rendered it a veritable bibliographic passography capable of translating any classificatory idea whatever into a number and the following bibliographic analysis in all its detail. So how many of you have heard of the term passography? So let's take a look at that. A passography is a sign system that encodes messages in such a way that they can be read off and understood by people speaking different languages, or, in other words, a code designed to be universally intelligible and so constituting a universal written language. So to take an example, a UDC number 536 can be read off as different words in different languages. Heat in English, chaleur in French, wärme in German, teplo in Czech, melegség in Hungarian, etc., etc. Each of these words, of course, has a very different form and will not be intelligible to people who don't speak all those other languages. However, if 536 is taken to represent the idea behind all of these words, then 536 will be intelligible to English speakers, French speakers, German speakers, Hungarian speakers, and so constitutes a notation that can serve as a communication medium across different languages. Recall Otlet's claim that the UDC numbers represent ideas and so in a sense transcend the natural language. This led him to the claim that the passographic nature of the UDC notation led natural that the class numbers correspond to ideas and not to words. They constitute a veritably international bibliographic nomenclature. Now, and nomenclature is simply a list of terms naming concepts. Since the UDC was both a passography and a nomenclature, Otlet suggested it could serve not only as a mechanism for assuring the internationality of bibliographic indexing, but also as a lexicographic tool and even a language learning aid. He claimed that each translation of the classification tables into a new language furnishes precious elements for the methodical study of a language. By comparing the different language editions of the UDC tables, one can use them as dictionaries for technical terms. But I thought that the encyclopedic nature and the methodic arrangement, a classed rather than an alphabetic arrangement, would make the UDC a more effective tool for learning a foreign vocabulary than alphabetically arranged dictionaries where the words are occurring outside of sort of an ideological context. Of course, he didn't take into account the fact that in order to use it as a dictionary, you have to have 2 or 3 massive volumes of tables in front and be constantly flipping back to the and forth between them. But for idealists, maybe such material considerations tend to fall by the wayside. In any case, note the contrast between the characterization of the UDC as an international bibliographic nomenclature with the claim cited earlier that it constitutes an international scientific language, because if a nomenclature is a set of names, it is only a fragment of a language. So again, Otlet is sort of shifting the linguistic characterization of the UDC. And in many ways, a nomenclature is perfectly appropriate to a documentary language. In fact, according to Ranganathan, the classificatory language should consist of only nouns and conjunctions, that is, the names of classes and the syntactic signs for building up noun phrases. Now, since time is short, I'm going to skip over the non-bibliographic uses for the UDC, but we'll be happy to come back to them if there is sufficient interest during the question period. And I suggest that you do ask about that, because it is a rather fascinating story. So, by way of a few assessments of Otlet's linguistic interpretation of the UDC, Otlet developed over the period between 1895 and 1906 a linguistic interpretation of the UDC that has to be considered an innovation when compared to the intellectual frame of reference of contemporaries such as Cutter, Dewey, and Kaiser. All of these people were thinking in terms of terms. All of them were dealing with problems of synonymy in their way. But they were not conceptualizing these problems in a strictly linguistic, grammatical framework in the way that Otlet was doing. Otlet's use of linguistic categories to describe the UDC was not always consistently applied. For example, as we have seen, there was a varying interpretation of how digits are to be interpreted. Sometimes he considered them to be words, sometimes he spoke of them as roots. But more often than not, I think that this sort of analogization of class numbers and of digits within the class numbers to linguistic entities like roots and words helped him to clarify key aspects of the UDC's notation and to make the distinction between different types of class numbers, those that are hierarchically constructed and those that are constructed facet-wise. Otlet understood the UDC to be both a classification and a bibliographic notation. In his opinion, it was the notation that made the UDC truly a documentary language, and this, as far as I can tell, is the first documented use of documentary language in documentation. Otlet's insistence on a notation that could express syntactic relationships marked an important first step in the development of synthetic faceted notations and classification systems, something that would be developed to much greater degree by Ranganathan later on, but even more so by some of the information retrieval theorists like Perry and Kent at Case Western University. But there was a hitch, because perhaps with Otlet there was too much emphasis on the notation at times. Bradford, famous for the Bradford scatter, who was also a zealot for the UDC and puffed it in his publications, noted that we should be careful not to reduce the appeal of the decimal classification by pretending that it's a panacea or that decimal notations have divine attributes. Because that was the way that many people tended to view it, that because the notation was fairly powerful in expressing some of these relationships, that the classification could be reduced to the notation. Ranganathan teaches us, however, that if one views classification as based on planes of work, an idea plane, a verbal plane, and a notation plane, that it is the idea plane that should govern how we develop the verbal expressions and the notation expressions of the classification. This was something that I'm not certain that Otlet always heeded. Now, Otlet assumed that the UDC should be a universal language in two senses of the word. Its vocabulary covered the whole of the universe of knowledge, so universal in that sense, but also universal in that its posigraphic qualities would make it accessible to a universally international audience. Now, Otlet was a totally committed internationalist, and thus saw it as a perfect medium for universal bibliography and as an expression of the unity of human science and human knowledge. So, as he wrote, from the point of view of international collaboration, it plays a role similar to that which one expects from the international language. An international language does not seek to oppose particular languages, nor to substitute itself for them, but solely to serve as an aid and complement for external relations. Thus, the universal bibliographic classification does not seek to substitute itself to the existing fragmentary scientific classifications, domain classifications, if you will, but to juxtapose itself to them to create a material bond of arrangement between all the productions of the mind. Now, when he's speaking of the international language, he had in mind Esperanto and its derivative Ido, which were international languages that were supposed to serve as auxiliary languages. The idea was that people would learn them in addition to their national languages and use Esperanto in international communications, because it was a neutral language that did not make any presuppositions or play favorites, so to speak, with national languages, but where everybody could meet on, so to speak, an equal linguistic footing. Otlet was proposing something similar for the UDC, in a sense, that the UDC would serve as a sort of switching language, a way in which one could neutralize the variations in different domains and bring them together to facilitate international documentary communication on a global scale. And this laid the groundwork for the idea that the UDC could serve as a switching language, an idea that would become especially current in the 1970s and 80s, and that to this day continues to be cultivated by some within the field of LIS. This notion of a switching language, however, would also then be used, develop a research front of its own in the 70s and 80s, with the production of such classifications as the broad system of ordering, etc. And one might even make the claim that the quest for unity in the midst of diversity continues to this day, although transposed to different form. Witness, for example, in the semantic web, with its reliance on shared frameworks for markup, such as XML, and data models such as RDF. One can fill those up with different contents, but nevertheless they are supposed to serve as universal structures by which one can then communicate data between different communities on a global scale within the semantic web. And so let me close with an envoi. Otlet's vision of the UDC as an artificial language was a product of a modernist milieu and displaced the rationalism and systemicity that were both a strength and a weakness of the cultural modernism from which it arose. It contains much that is useful, but also much that requires modification if it is to answer to the needs of today. For example, there is much to be said for notational universality. Conceptual universality, many of us recognize, is a much more problematic posture. Thus, it is a task of contemporary students of information science in general and knowledge organization in particular to winnow Otlet's model, employing those ideas that are useful and replacing those that can no longer answer to the needs of today. It is in this way that we can best honor Otlet since contemporary's pioneering efforts and leverage the legacy, the historical legacy of knowledge organization in a truly productive fashion. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions or go back and look at some of the more bizarro uses of the UDC. Yes?
Wasn't he involved with UNESCO? Or am I
think that he he was a bit before UNESCO, I think, so that he was involved with
League
other.
of Nations and yeah.
He was in contact with them and trying to get the League of Nations to help support some of his ventures, and also trying to support the League of Nations ventures. But unfortunately for Otlet, one can almost divide up his career into two phases: one up to the Great War, 1914 to 1918, and one after. And the sort of distilled story is that up to the Great War, a lot of his projects seemed to find some sort of success in actually being implemented. So that the IIB was able to implement his universal bibliographic repertoire, and although they were always in arrears as to what they were claiming they would have classified, they were making progress. In 1907, he founded an office for the an international association for international associations that actually held congresses in 1910, and he was able to bring some of the contacts that he made in those congresses into the International Institute for Bibliography. With World War II, however, everything, and he was also getting support from the Belgian government and from other governmental agencies. After World War II, a lot of that support fell apart, and energies were diverted elsewhere. And so that one might say that the last 20 or so years of Otlet's life were more blighted years for him, where he was trying to keep up interest in the projects he had formed, as well as to constantly generate new projects. He wanted to create a world city in Brussels that would, in a sense, be an instantiation of world peace and international cooperation within a total sort of urban framework. His thought tended to get more and more utopian over time, and thus find less and less support from the powers that be. But one might say that a lot of his ideas were eventually taken up by UNESCO and could be viewed as precursors to ideas like, say, bibliographic control that came up in that was first articulated explicitly as an objective in the 1950s, and then developed in the 1960s and 70s within the cataloging world. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm working on a book on information policy research and its inputs into policymaking. And I came today because it occurred to me that I believe I had read that UNESCO had taken up the framework where you just were at the close here, and that it provided the foundation for the global circulation of documents that they were promoting, which was a very unusual way of thinking about.
Yeah. I would really recommend getting a copy of Boyd Rayward's translation, some international, I forget the name of the book right now, but it's a book of translations of articles where Otlet has a couple of articles there where he lays out, in a sense, a vision for a global documentary system, first on a national scale, but eventually on an international scale. And a lot of those ideas, I think, later on fed into some of these later policy discussions, especially after his ideas also were translated into English in the 1920s and the 1930s through people like Bradford and Pollard with the British Bibliographic Society, and then found a real footing there. I'm less familiar with what was going on in the policy world, say among the Francophones and the German speakers.
Questions? Or?
or do you want to see sort of the bizarre application?
That's, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's
Okay, yeah. So, going back to the nomenclature, and nomenclature is not a language per se. Thus, for bibliographic purposes, the UDC remained a nomenclature whose class numbers were what Otlet called number roots. However, Otlet proposed that it could also be expanded to form a full artificial language through the addition of an auxiliary table of grammatical endings. These endings were to be applied as a superscript to the class numbers, thus converting the latter from number roots to number words. And this would result in a numerically coded artificial language that, according to Otlet, could be used for certain types of non-bibliographic communication, such as telegrams. So here's Otlet's table of grammatical and syntactical functions. You could then code to have a noun or a substantive, persons, such as first, second, or third persons of pronouns and verbs, genders, number as in singular or plural, tense as in past, present, future, mood, where he actually plays fast and loose with what mood is. He includes indicative, imperative, and subjunctive, which then of course clanks in the participle, for going back to the infinitive. Identity, which for him is the copula is, or the negative copula is not, active and passive voice, so another sort of dodgy sort of categorization. General relations, which are basically prepositional relations. Modality, which are adverbial phrases, and quantity phrases like much or less. And the demonstrative or possessive. And we can in fact see the language in action because he provided a sample sentence. He took the sentence. Say we have the sentence, the health service will transport by sailing ships the volunteer workers struck with dysentery. And this is his sentence, not mine. This would be the translation in the UDC language. 35.6 to 338 superscript, da-da-da superscript, da-da-da superscript, da-da-da superscript. How do we encode that? This would be health service, the superscript indicating that it's a noun and a subject. So, health service. This becomes water transport, sailing ships, active voice, future tense. So that he's, in a sense, verbing, so to speak, a class number. But also notice that he's playing fast and loose again with the structure, because the class number should refer only to sailing ships as such. But what he's doing again is sort of breaking out the notion that you have an agglutination, so that how he was interpreting this was probably as water transport, active voice, future tense, by means of sailing ships. But to do so, he sort of had to cheat grammatically. Volunteer workers plus noun plus direct object, so that you have, and finally, and this is the bizarre thing, for dysentery, passive voice, so that this is literally health service will transport by means of sailing ship the dysenteried volunteer workers. And it gets even weirder, because Otlet's proposal to use the UDC was for the most part not acknowledged by contemporaries, though it made its way into later presentations of the UDC as selling. Yep.
Can you go back a second?
Yeah. No.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that.
Yep.
Don't ask me why I want to make sure I understand this, but I'm wondering, is it possible to read that sentence or to misunderstand that sentence based on those numbers as the health service? Wait, health service. No, the sailing ships. The volunteer workers on the sailing ships have dysentery. I mean, is it possible to misinterpret that based?
Probably not, because he would presumably add some. This is from the table of nouns. He would probably put in something from the table of relations or the prepositional things. But you would probably have I'm not certain, however, that he would be able to make that sort of grammatical transformation. Again, whenever you give sample sentences, you tend to choose sentences that work to your advantage. And so he chose a simple one: subject, verb, direct object, and a modifier for a direct object. And then sort of glozed over whatever complication. So that's a very good question. As far as I know, this is the only sentence that exists in this language. And that could actually be an interesting exercise to see what sort of telegraphic sentences. But nevertheless, there is a certain logic because note that the numbers are compressed so that you can communicate a certain amount of information in a rather crude form in a few numbers. And if one considers the rates for sending telegrams, this could have constituted a savings. And that was actually one of the arguments that Otlet made, that this could be a cheap way of sending messages by telegram. So an inflection of the UDC and economic considerations. In any case, to get back to an even more Baroque development, in 1923, Vsevolod Cheshikhin, a Russian language planner, was developing a family of Esperanto-based languages called Nepal, which means grandchild, because it was supposed to be a grandchild of Esperanto. Proposed what he called Nepo decimal, or decimal Nepo. This consisted of adding Esperanto grammatical endings to UDC class numbers. So you would have 59972.5 oi, meaning horses, or 2 oi, meaning, say, religion, which is 200. However, notice that there you're still dealing with a specifically, but he goes even further and suggests that by assigning syllables from a modified solfège scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, to the digits 0 to 9, it would be possible to create a spoken or even sung version of Nepodecimal named Guidareka, named after Guido d'Arezzo, who created the stave system in the music. So for horses, which in the pasigraphy is 59972.5 oi, it would become sol de désiré sol o, and this presumably could then be sung. Otlet, and it's interesting that Otlet in his traité de documentation cited both of Cheshikhin's ideas favorably, of course, because as interesting proposals for the use of UDC as a pasigraphy. However, for pretty obvious reasons, it does not appear that anything ever came of these proposals. But in any case, this is we may smile at it nowadays, but this nevertheless is evidence that for Otlet, he was taking a linguistic interpretation of the UDC as something serious, because it's possible to view it as a certain form of puffery that for the UDC, if the idea of an international language was in the air in the 1890s or into the 1900s, and one of the ways to make the UDC more marketable is to claim that it's a type of language. But the fact that not only was he in communication with Cheshikhin about this, because Cheshikhin in one of his articles cites like a written communication from Otlet saying that this sounds like a very good idea, but that he was willing to cite it in the Traité de Documentation, and that he in fact wrote an article claiming that the UDC could be used as a medium for telegraphic communication, indicates that for him the idea of UDC as a language was a live issue, one not only for documentary, but also for extra documentary uses. Any other questions?
Opera. Yeah, opera.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.